Hello, everybody, and welcome back to DevSecOn Netherlands. This is our first event for 2023. The last event was, if I remember correctly, in October. So this year we're planning to do more, maybe live. We are actually planning a live event in April, maybe a workshop. So stay tuned. I'm Davide Cioccia, and I'm the DevSecOn chapter lead for the Netherlands, responsible to organize events all around DevSecOps security, application security. And today with me, there is Chris Nesbitt-Smith. I'll bring him in a second. Hello, Chris.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. How you doing?
Pretty good, pretty good. As we said in the backstage, almost weekend, right?
Nearly.
Yes, finally, I would say. So, Chris, today we'll talk about policy as code, a very interesting topic, especially when it comes also to infrastructure as code, right? All the Terraform, AWS CDK, and I'm really looking forward to this presentation. So, Chris, I will leave the stage to you. I'll bring your presentation. There we go. And the floor is yours.
Cool. Let me just reorientate myself and make sure I don't get any bleeps. My screen's gone blank. Why's that? Cool. Okay. So imagine a live experience. I get to stand up. I almost not have to worry too much about mute, but at least I get to use my clicker. So it's pretty exciting. So thank you for joining me. Okay, so elephant in the room, policy is a dull thing. It's kind of hard to make it sexy, but I'm going to at least try and get your attention. So bear with me. So to set the scene, I'm in a lift, and yes, any American friends joining us, we really do call them lifts. And 4 people walk in. I think to myself, Chris, this is your moment, now or never. As the doors close and I position myself in front of them, a captive audience, they're mine. I've got them. And as I hear them seal shut behind me, I take a breath. I look to the first person on my left. She's in a suit. She looks really important to her. I gesture to her, see? She looks at me back at me as if to say, yes, go on. She nods, perfect, the CIO, the policymaker, the one whose neck is on the block. Well, what were the chances of finding you in my imaginary lift today? I ask her, well, what keeps you up at night? She tells me, I don't know what teams are really doing, what's the volume of risk, and what I should then show more interest in. Setting and changing policy is slow and hard to communicate. And people just go off and do their own thing, and they think they know better. And to be honest, often they do. But then I'm left playing catch up with the risk that they've signed me up to. Okay, I say, try not to sound like a patronizing snake oil salesman. I can help. I turn my attention to the second person in a suit. They look less important. I make a guess. Let's face it, this is my imagination. It would be weird if I was wrong. Product manager, I say. They nod. Okay, the whip cracker. I say, well, what's important to you? So managing risk, mostly opportunity risk, which is the fear of missing out. So getting features out the door and avoiding getting bogged down with, as they glance to the CIO, bureaucracy that is almost seemingly designed to slow me down. Awesome, I say. This is your lucky day. I turn to the next person, dressed in overalls. I'm in a trendy part of town. They could be the CTO. Before I ask, they sense me staring at them. Cleaner, they say. Oh, okay. How did you get my imagination? I'll come back to you. My attention goes to the last person. Hoodie, headphones around their neck. My stereotypical developer. Yes, I know you well. What code do you write? I ask. Well, it doesn't matter. Python? Cool. Have you got everything updated to work with? I pause. Python 3 they offer? Yeah, Python 3. Well, that must be really hard, I add. They don't know it yet, but I just implicitly won a bit of their trust, which is, after all, important. Nearly, they say. Cool. Okay, well, what's important to you? So staying on top of patching dependencies so we can react to the next fire, knowing what rules exist, what ones I can bend, break, and ultimately what might cause me to lose my job. Writing consistent, good quality code, avoiding technical debt, and effectively the rest of my team being able to cohesively work as though we were one. Do you use any tools to help you with that? So yeah, linters, code quality, test coverage, the usual. Great, I say. I write code too. Let's be friends. And I hand them a printed QR code. and say, here's my public GPG key. So you know that you can trust me when I talk. I return my focus to the cleaner. I've got it. How do you get told what to do and then when it changes? Well, we get a memo or something stuck to a notice board. So last week we got a memo saying that all the meeting room whiteboards needed to be cleaned every night. Interesting, I say. How does this work out? Well, it's then up to us to maintain that to-do list so we can onboard new people. Does it go wrong at all? Yeah, so sometimes if we compile our operational manual wrong or we miss a memo, don't apply them in sequence, we do get things wrong. They glance apologetically to the product manager, like when we hadn't updated the guide that the meeting room on the 3rd floor was being used as a dedicated war room, and we wiped all their boards down. I look to the dev. Does this sound familiar? They nod. Turns out we're not all special snowflakes, hey? Okay, all is not lost. I knew that there was a reason that I imagined you all here today. The lift is slowing. I feel it coming to its destination. Great, I've got the silver bullet for you too. The CIO looks to me ready to buy literally whatever it is I'm selling. They ask me as the doors open, who are you and what team are you in? As I move out the way to stop obstructing it, I answer, I don't work here. I'm just here to fix the lift. People have been complaining it only goes to the top floor no matter what button they push. And it's actually pretty slow. My audience storms out, furious, heading towards the stairs, and the door shuts and I get back to my job. Okay, so if any of that might sound at least vaguely familiar and you can relate to at least one of my imaginary friends, then I may have some answers for you. So what if I said that you could update policy even without even releasing several version updates, not just in a year, a month? What about 10 updates in a single day? And seamlessly communicate that to the people that need to consume it, all without derailing them. You could have visibility on compliance using tools that you already use. And that policy could be readily consumable, easy to pass, demonstrate compliance, make sense, and not be bureaucratic to change when it needs and not get in the way. That same policy could be treated as a dependency and operate like a linter, so you can run compliance checks locally in CI and then guard production ultimately. That multiple versions of the policy, like a dependency, are supported. So emergencies like you must update now because there are now known vulnerability type updates and an old version are actually just a business as usual activity to communicate. Sound interesting? Okay, hang around. I'm doing about all right for time. This would be the normal point if we were in person where I'd allow the organisers to unlock the doors, but alas. So hopefully I've at least got your attention and it's at least time to introduce myself and start explaining things. So my name is Chris Nesbitt-Smith and I'm an instructor for Learn K8 and also Control Plane. I'm a consultant to the Crown Prosecution Service, which is a bit of UK government, and a tinkerer of open source kind of stuff in general. I've spent a fair chunk of my professional career now working in kind of UK government and large organisations where problems like this are rife. We should have some time at the end for questions and your best heckles, of course. So please do leave a comment in the chat. If not, come find me on LinkedIn or something afterwards. So, or the Discord actually as well. So, given that I've got at least potentially some live audience, I don't know how many we've kind of got watching this live, but if we could have like, if you leave a comment, actually that's probably the best way of doing this. If you leave a comment in the chat and let me know if you've kind of set policy before. So if you're with my CIO and have written or applied any sort of policy before, can you leave a comment in the chat of policy maker? So any sort of coding standards that you might have set over a team, or even if it's like tab indentation or something obscure like that. Cool. Okay, next round. So if you've ever sought exemption or consciously bent, broken, circumvented, ignored, bypassed, whatever a policy with, let's hope, at least some good intentions, if you could leave a comment of policy breaker in the chat. Hopefully giving you enough time to put that in. Cool. Well, if you contributed to that one, at least you've fallen for it. And thanks to the organisers, we've got all of your names and employers' details down. So lend me your ears. The stakes just got raised. So where do I see kind of policy as code going wrong? Well, before we dig into that, what do I mean by policy? Well, it usually comes in one of two forms. So security enforcing, like, say, data at rest being encrypted, or consistency enforcing, such as code style, so tabs being 2 or 4 spaces indentated, maybe. Or maybe you can think of some others, but in any case, it's hopefully intended to mitigate a risk of some sort. However, with the best of intentions, these are often emotionally led rather than being grounded in a proportionate control, which finds itself as the open door to case-by-case exemptions being required when you come against a situation that you weren't anticipating. This is not unlike how the laws of the land are created, with case law making for a complex to navigate rulebook, with then harder still to measure compliance. It can often look like the thin bit of a wedge where the precedent, which may have been an uncomfortable pill to swallow the first time round, becomes dangerous, with others then looking to expand upon its scope. Which can then lead us to sometimes wonder if the cure was actually worse than the disease. But that's not how we, at least typically, develop software. So why does this all have to be so hard? Surely there must be a better answer. Well, we codified everything else, so isn't that the answer? Well, yes, in part, but my point of the talk is that we do it wrong. So maybe some of you out there are all screaming your favorite product name at me in your heads and as the solution, and you're not wholly wrong, but the devil is in the detail. Throwing some curly braces or YAML, as now it all has to be YAML, at something doesn't actually inherently fix things on its own. If it's a security control, it's often tempting to keep this policy a secret. Exposing it could maybe be used against you by an adversary. However, this does not support us at all in shifting left. It results in devs effectively reverse engineering what the policy is by finding out when we smash our heads up against it. Therefore, it doesn't take much imagination to see that in a scenario of, say, an application deploy midway through, finding that one of your resources is non-compliant and becomes rejected could leave your overall deploy in an inconsistent halfway state, perhaps likely resulting in some downtime. Which begs the question of, was that policy better than the downtime and business impact? Especially if that then leads your engineers, who are all hopefully plenty smart people, finding inventive, shall we say, ways around the computer says no response that they got. This is then further exacerbated when updates to the policy are desired. So maybe you get a pen test or something goes wrong, so you form that case law and need to apply new policy. So maybe all S3 buckets now need to be encrypted, a change that could be considered a breaking one. Sure, you might say you provide warnings on at least the less important issues or new emerging policies, which is great, so long as someone sees them. But if you've adopted GitOps or at least CI/CD, is anyone actually seeing those warnings? I mean, who studies the results of a successful build log every time? Anyone? Every time? Well, if you are, I'd politely suggest you might be missing the point of CI/CD. You should, after all, be able to trust your build job status. Okay, I'm not just here to throw stones. So if we remember my implied promises to my 4 imaginary friends of what this utopian land might look like, well, there's nothing new under the sun. We've actually already unwittingly solved most, if not all, of these problems elsewhere. We just need to be reminded and then join the dots together. Well, the first is something, if you're doing policy as code, you're probably already doing. So put it in version control. The thing you might not be doing, though, is then making that visible. So at least inner source it, by which I mean allow anyone within your walled garden of employees, suppliers, and so on to see the policy. I'm not saying give away all your threat monitoring and intel away, but you can keep that kind of all knowledge all to yourselves. But I'd argue that visible policy and the gaps therein is often better than the potential downtime, reverse engineered workarounds, and opaque legacied exemption spaghetti soup. If you're brave, you might even open source it. You'll find it unlocks the ability to work well with prospective suppliers without NDAs. And after all, widely distributed secrets are expensive to maintain, difficult to handle, and often only stay secret for so long after all. Okay, so we're off to a good start. Our policy is visible now to those that need to see it. So many of you are no doubt used to semantic versioning, but a quick recap. The first segment is used to indicate breaking, perhaps conflicting changes. In the context of policy, let's say it's requiring resources to have a department label. Maybe that will help with some internal cross-charging. Who knows? I'm not judging. An increment to that might look like requiring that to be from a predetermined list rather than just being free text. The second segment is to indicate minor changes. These shouldn't really break anyone. An increment to that might look like correcting a spelling mistake in one of those department names. The third segment is to indicate patch changes. So these should be a no-brainer for everyone to keep up to date with. An increment to that might look like adding a department to the available options. Okay, so our policy is visible in the repository now. It's versioned. We can easily communicate the policy. We can tack on release notes, and expectations are all managed by semantic versioning. In software, we're used to handling dependencies. So what if your policy was just another dependency? You might actually unwittingly already be doing this if, for example, you have, say, ESLint as a dependency in your JavaScript package, perhaps. Okay, so our policy is visible in a repository. It's versioned. We can easily communicate the policy, tack on the release notes. We've got expectations are set by Semver. It's beginning to look a lot more like software. Okay, I know testing is a dirty word, but in order to make this an asset that then everyone can depend on and also provide some known good examples, tests are essential to give everyone involved the stability and surface potential side effects before they just hurt everyone involved. Consumers of this policy need to be able to test themselves against the policy locally and also in CI/CD, thus shortening the feedback loop and better informing. As a bonus, we should be able to find consumers able to rely on the artifact that we're then sharing with them. Okay, well, we're well and truly on the home stretch. It's a dependency, so updating it should be no different to any other. We can even use some magic like GitHub's Dependable or Men's Renovate to do that for us. So think automatic pull requests, tests, and even auto-merging if you like. Okay, so to check everyone is still with me, can anyone tell me a recent event that caused people to want to know what version of a certain logging Java doohickey you were potentially running literally everywhere in the estate? Give a second, see if anyone comes in on the chat, or you can answer.
We have a question actually.
I'll come to that at the end if that's all right. If we can.
All right.
If that's all right. If that's okay. Cool.
Good.
Cool. Okay. Spoilers. So, as you know, all presentations since, well, sometime about 14 months ago now, are contractually required to reference kind of log4j and shell4j, right? Even when it's almost entirely out of context, and include some awesome memes. Hopefully soon I'll be able to just remove these from the deck and just point broadly at a list of scary looking CVEs in order to command your behavior through fear. What I'm getting at here, though, is that the situational awareness piece around software supply chain is something that your organization is hopefully already thinking about, if not already addressing. So if our policy is a dependency, this at least is not a new problem. So software bill of materials for the win, right? Which can then allow us to measure the compliance across the estate. Okay, so I've just covered a lot of ground and hopefully sounded at least vaguely convincing, and it's not just a fictional utopia painted in PowerPoint. And it's time to look at how you might be actually able to do this. And I know you all kind of came here really wanting to see a million words on a slide and not just the odd emoji or two. So we've reached the point where I get to show you some code. Hooray! Maintain scope, though, I'm going to limit this to talking about two things to prove that this is not just one tech or one tool. I've arbitrarily picked Terraform and Kubernetes, but I could have probably picked anything. Naturally, I'll need some tools to go along with this. I'm too lazy really to invent much here myself. So likewise, I'm going to pick two tools. But again, I could use any, some, or even all probably. Checkov in this case is going to be doing my Terraform, and Caverno is going to be doing my Kubernetes. If you want to browse along with me, I've created an example GitHub organization here, which I'll paste a link to in the chat in a bit. I'm not expecting you to read or kind of grok this code that's on screen, so don't worry about it too much. It's just to prove that it's a real thing and it kind of hangs together. So the policy is stored here in this repository. So here's where my policy starts at version 1.0. I've got policy that requires a department label on all the resources. So long as it's set, doesn't actually matter what it is. I've written tests for this, so you can note how the passing test cases are usable as a great example about what good and bad looks like. We've pushed a tag in Git, we've added release notes, and I can sign it to provide further assurance if my heart so desires, which of course it does. But moving on. Version 2 looks similar, only now that department field has to be from a predetermined list. Like before, tests exist, release notes are written, tags are signed. 2.1.0 is where we notice and correct that spelling mistake of one of the options in the list of departments. And 2.1.1, and I've now added a new department to the list. A few more repositories in that organization, so app1 and infra1. Well, they depend on version 1.0 of the policy. It's not compliant with version 2 or beyond, but how can I know this? So I configured renovate in this case to actually automatically make me a pull request. So when there's a new version of the policy, it's super obvious if I can update that dependency, and I can see clear feedback about where and why I'm not compliant. I can also see all the pull requests over the org as a quick hack shortcut to measure the compliance of my policy. Moving on from that, app2 and infra2, well, they depend on version 2.0 of the policy. However, we could merge the open pull request all the way up to 2.1.1. And finally, app3 and infra3, a few more repositories, are dependent on version 2.1.1, and they get a gold star from the CIO. There is a small touch of magic, and it's not pretty, though. I've written some bash. So don't judge me, even though I've probably, definitely, absolutely, all the time written much worse. But what this does is it allows me from my dev laptop or in CI to evaluate my code against the version of the policy. Ideally, this is less cumbersome, but it is what it is for now. Pull requests are all very welcome. And the last piece of the puzzle is managing the life cycle of the policies and allowing multiple versions of the same policy to be accepted and evaluated within the single runtime. I've cheated a bit here. Kube gives you admission controllers. It's not so easy to get the same policy evaluation in cloud that you can execute locally. They've got their own policy code stuff going on. I've not figured out how to be able to kind of evaluate or execute that policy locally. Again, pull requests, contribution, collaboration, all very welcome in this space. So you may have noticed the way that my policy was written and distributed lends itself well to coexist in a Kubernetes cluster with itself. Which brings me to cluster 1, which describes a cluster that accepts all of the versions of the policy that we've described so far, by virtue of the fact that I have deployed all versions of the policy. Likewise, cluster 2 only accepts version 2 and greater. I've automated to prove some of this with Kind and GitHub Actions for CI to deploy the applications. And there we have it, a full org, all done, all compliant, all versions, CIO, all wonderfully aware of what's going on. So this is great, right? But just one more thing. Wouldn't it be awesome if that policy carried a story or a narrative about why it exists in the first place? After all, if your agile team is even half effective, it will reject anything it perceives as friction if it doesn't see the value in it. This could allow our devs to know why they're compliant. And if they want to do something outside of what the policy permits, They don't need any sort of exemption granted per se. They can have a well-reasoned and informed debate with rationale behind a pull request to the policy. So imagine, if you will, this going through a stage of versions with risks that inform the mitigations, all manifested as the policy, maintained as one. So when the risk landscape changes, your policies can move with it. So, for example, when some new privacy regulation comes out, or maybe your latest marketing strategy pays off and you acquire more data, even if your policy was perfect at one time, the risks and the appetite will stand still for no one. We can liken this in some ways to over-provisioning that we might be familiar with from elsewhere, where lead times are long and change is hard and there is significant pressure in nailing it the first time, which can lead to hedging bets against what some future state might be, rather than describing proportionate mitigation to the risks that are more tangibly real in the now. And that's where the real culture change is needed, and the execution of that is likely a long series of talks in of itself. And that's where this is really over to you. Honestly, the best thing any of you watching could do right now is tell me this is madness, already done, irrelevant, or otherwise totally unachievable, something my esteemed echo chamber peers have yet to do. So beyond making pull requests and developing the theory more, I'd really like to start building more case studies with more willing real organizations and allow me to swap out more of my imaginary friends for some real ones. But the most important thing that I want you to remember from our time together is that, and feel free to say this out loud with me, that purposeless policy is potentially practically pointless policy. I've been practicing saying far too many times. So I've been Chris Nesbitt-Smith. Thank you so much for your time. You're now free to leave. We'll try and destroy the evidence of your guilt admissions earlier. Try. Like, subscribe, whatever the kids do on LinkedIn, GitHub, and you can be rest assured there'll be no spam or much content at all, since I'm awful at self-promotion, especially on social media. CNS.me just points at my LinkedIn, and talks.cns.me contains this and other talks. They're all open source as well. Questions are all very welcome on this or anything else. We'll be kind of hanging around for a while, or in the Discord for the DevSecCon Discord as well. Or find me on LinkedIn as well, if that's easier. Cool. So I think the one question that we've got in already that we can pick on.
Yeah, we've got a question from Michael. I'll put it on screen here. In what context will policies actually have to remain hidden? I think you mentioned something about that at the beginning.
Yeah, ideally not. Like, if there's a really good business case and it makes sense to, then I guess sure. I guess the often spaces this kind of occurs where you've kind of got some legacy stuff, like here be dragons over there. And that's the same of like a lot of other kind of bits of perimeter around that, where you know that there are problems. And you might kind of make a legacied kind of exemption for that stuff, if that makes sense. But ideally, like, the aspiration is that if you've exposed it to everyone that could possibly need to know it, then you're far less likely to have workarounds and kind of and also, like, you've shared the narrative about why it exists. So not just the policy itself of thou shalt not do something, but the reason why, which is the more compelling thing. It's much easier when you've got in a physical world where you can go, well, you need to lock the office door because it's full of computers and there's a stack of cash on the table or whatever it might be, right? You're going to go, well, it makes sense, right? Whereas in software, it's less physical. There's less of a kind of tangible kind of connection to whatever it is that's at risk. And I think that's often a kind of a bit where we as engineers can often lose context of the actual real world consequences that stem from some of the workarounds that we might come up with. And the policy was hopefully at least written at some point, hopefully with more than just emotion. There was hopefully some actual risk that it was supposed to be mitigating, but the disconnect that exists between those is real.
Cool. Thanks. And maybe one question from me, well, maybe two. Well, so you have a GitHub repo where you publish a sample demo project. Can the community contribute to it? And if yes, how or what you're looking for?
Yes, please. So yeah, the repo's on the screen at the minute. I will paste a link to it in the YouTube chat. But yes, pull requests are very, very welcome. Or ping me if you want, like, to actually chat through anything, and talk philosophically about it as well. And the Discord too.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's absolutely very, very welcome. Yeah, it's intended as an open source project, as a bit of a thought exercise, as a thing to explore. Or as to say, ideally, just tell me that I'm an idiot and it's totally undoable. In which case I'll just archive all the repos and call it a day. And that's fine too. And I can stop arcing on about it. I'd be perfectly happy either way. That would be a lot easier than me trying to force it down folks' neck.
Cool. But maybe just one other question, because what do you think, or based on your experience, what are the biggest challenges for DevSecOps to implement something like that? Let's say, because they got like multiple projects, very fast speed in release. So what do you see as the biggest challenge or biggest challenges in implementing policy as code?
And it's always people, right? It's always going to be the people, unsurprisingly. That's always where like, the tech is fine. Like, the tech's the easy bit. That's like done to death. But yeah, it's around kind of the people, and as I say, it's around the cultural change of being able to actually articulate the reason behind the risk. So it's not just you have to do it this way, which inevitably kind of go developers perfectly rightly thinking, and engineer and DevOps engineers or whoever else perfectly correct in their belief that no, that doesn't apply to them, and then seeking an exemption. But in doing so, you've made it very hard to maintain peace with kind of managing those case by case exemptions. And you can often end up like being tempted into having to renew those attestations or something else like regularly, if at all. And the policy can move along. And if there's an exemption for a whole project, then you will never probably actually apply any more control back to that.
Correct.
So a lot of it is it's doing it from ground zero, right? So when you've started, like, land some sort of policy in and increment on it. Like, if it's done through this, the whole intention is that in the same way as how most developers, most folk writing code will probably use something like a linter, and to make sure that syntax looks the same between one developer and the next, and everyone agrees on that. So, like, start with something simple that just at least gives you some validation of a 1.0 of your policy. Doesn't need to be particularly active or do that much, but increment that. And once you've got it bedded in and you've got a bi-directional relationship with your engineers and your risk owners, so you can have a meaningful conversation about risk, whatever, and what the team want to do, then those things are joined up, and the developers can make a pull request to the repository and have a decent conversation about it, rather than having a whole exemption that's isn't codified. It's just a conceptual thing that's probably on a spreadsheet somewhere, if you're lucky.
Yeah, cool. No. I totally agree. Indeed. I mean, this is something that worth to explore and work on to bring risk policies, this whole world close to developers, to also security folks, that to implement, to be closer to the development team. That's the mission, I would say, of the DevSecOps. Okay, I think we do not have more questions. So if you have more questions, of course, the presentation is recorded, so you can write in the Discord channel as well. In our, I'll just put this is the Discord channel of DevSecOn Netherlands, or you can contact Chris directly. We'll be happy to respond to your questions. So thanks for joining. Thanks, Chris, for keeping us company today on this with this cool talk. And this is DevSecOn Netherlands, and is brought to you by SNCC. The next event will be again in April, and we are aiming for a live event. So join us. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.